Really delighted to be here. Of course, I would have preferred to meet you all in person, and that was the original plan. But as they say, make lemonade out of lemons. And I think that would be probably a good theme for today, is sort of how do you capture, both as individuals, leaders within your company who are helping other leaders to develop and lead at their best, how do you allow them to take the lemons that they're facing at the moment and really make lemonade out of it? And so we're doing that here today. We're practicing what we preach, and hopefully we'll be giving you some good tips on how to do that within your organizations as well as learning from you. I'm sure many of you are already facing these questions and living them day to day. So also looking forward to learning from you. I'm going to share my slides here. So let me see. I'm still becoming a Zoom user, so hopefully, I believe you can see my slides now. So as I said, as Jillian said, I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior here at IMD. I'm not at IMD today, but I am in Switzerland. And what I've been focusing on, I'm a social psychologist by training. For the last few years, I've received more and more questions from the clients that I work with. For those of you who aren't familiar with IMD or haven't worked with us, we are a business school that is dedicated 100% to executive education. So when I talk about clients, I'm talking about my clients that we work with for development programs. And more in the last couple of years, I was asked the question of, well, how is leadership changing in a time of digital disruption? So, and Jillian knows this because we've worked together on this topic before, I've spent the last couple of years trying to answer this question along with my colleagues here at IMD, and doing so in a very data-based way. So running surveys, doing studies, and I'll share with you some of the findings that have come out of that research, and what I also think can be applied to the current time, because maybe we're not only facing digital disruption now, but just wholesale disruption. And what might we learn from the work we've done on digital disruption to apply it to the current time and give us some clues on how to help develop the leaders that we work with on a daily basis. So the setup of the session this morning with me will be as follows. We will spend a little time with an introduction, and I also have a poll. I'm curious from you to do a little bit of live research, your experiences and your views. And then I will turn it over to Amelie. And Amelie is coming from UBS. She does learning and development with the Swiss-based bank. And I will turn it over to her, and we will learn from her experiences, what she is doing. And then we will turn it over to you for a breakout session. I'll describe more what we expect from you during that breakout session and the purpose of the breakout session. As Jillian said, we'll be asking you to capture some of what you talk about in that breakout session and share it with the rest of the group so we can learn from each other. And then we'll spend the last 20 minutes sharing those learnings, having some space for Q&A, and I will then close it out. So as I said, I want to turn it over to you for a poll. If you've never used Mentimeter, this is your time to do so. So the way this will work is I'm going to share another screen. And it will look like this. So what you will see on your screen, hopefully, is I'm going to make it full screen. There we go. And what I hope is that you see, oops, I got a Mentimeter. Is that you go to menti.com, www.menti.com. You can do this on your computer, on your phone, and you're going to use the code 661787 to dial in. And what I want to see is, in your opinion, in general, okay, so actually I'm going to go back. In general, not necessarily with the COVID crisis, but in general, how directive do you think leaders need to be in the current time versus how adaptable? So we can think about directive as being more on the giving orders side, being more clear in exactly what you're expecting, being more outcome focused versus very adaptable. And this is not just in the COVID crisis, but in general. So we see that if 1 is very directive, 8 is very adaptable, we're leaning already more to the adaptable side. I'm going to wait. We have 41 participants, and I'm going to wait till we're about at 80 or so. We're moving more towards the center. So I made the scale so that there was no midpoint. You have to choose a little bit of one side or the other. You can't say equal and equal. Wait for a few more people to participate. All right, so we're at, in general, I'm going to stop here. We're at 65, we have 65 participants. You're saying about 6.2 out of an 8-point scale in terms of how directive versus adaptable a leader needs to be during times of crisis in general. And I'll be curious to know why you gave that score, why you think you need to be more adaptable than directive. Now we're going to move over to a more specific question, which is, in the current time of COVID, how directive versus adaptable do you think leaders need to be? So we're going to go to the second question. I'll wait again until about 65 people have voted. All right, that's interesting. So we're about at 70 people. It's significantly lower. So we have 6.2 for crisis in general. We have now 5.4 for leaders during time of COVID. And I'm going to go out of the poll. So I'm going to stop the share there. The poll will end, and I'm going to go back to my slides. And when we're looking at this, I'm curious for you to type in the chat, maybe just a few people, saying if you gave a different score for leaders in general during times of crisis versus leaders during the current COVID crisis, why you gave people a more directed score for COVID than you did for directing during times of crisis in general. Maybe just a few comments in the chat. I would love to see what you are thinking in this space. Because honestly, I was predicting the opposite, that you're going to say leaders need to be more adaptable during the current time than during crises in general. Right now, people want clear instructions. Thank you, Raj. Comfort? Yeah. Clear directions, got to go fast. Yep, speed. So I'm seeing here, giving teams comfort, clear instructions, right? We need to move fast, and so with more fast speed, we need more directive leadership. How the team is coping, Judy says, I think it depends on how the team is coping. In COVID adaptability, it is important, but some days they ask for and need clear support in cutting through challenges. I gave the same score for both situations. This is from Pascal. I gave a 7. We can monitor without being overly directive. So what I think is interesting, so Anna says, listening to the need, yet delivering clear and concise messages. So what I think is interesting here is that traditionally, all the research on leading during crisis says that because of speed, so we talked about speed, and also uncertainty, leaders need to be more directive. And I'm wondering, and I don't have any data on this, but during the current crisis time, do we actually need to be more adaptable than the classic crisis management template for a leader, because things are changing so rapidly and because we don't know necessarily what the data will say from day to day. And so as an organization, we need, and we're seeing this at IMD, to be more adaptable to new regulations, to new announcements around numbers, to data, and even more adaptable than the running model for crisis management. But that's what we want to hear from you. I'm going to share my slides again. Let's go back to sharing the screen. Share. So hopefully now everyone can see my slides again. We've done the poll. So in the current environment, at least when I am working with clients, and I'm very fortunate that I'm still in contact with many of my clients that I work with at IMD, I'm able to listen to them, hear some of what their challenges are, but there's also many clients that have gone silent during this time, and I'm not sure where they are. And I'm guessing that for leaders, they're experiencing the same thing with their teams and with their own clients. Some people are very in touch and are checking in every day, and then there might be, if you're working virtually, some members of your team or some clients that are going silent, and there's also that uncertainty in your social group. But what we're seeing is that the current environment includes uncertainty, rapid changes, fast pace of change, a great deal of stress from this uncertainty. So what my colleague George Kohlreiser says, and I love this quote, and it comes from his own research, working with in crisis situations as well as with hostage situations, is that people don't dislike change. Actually, human beings adapt very well to change, but they don't like uncertainty. And so if as a leader, you can take away some of that uncertainty, and I saw that you mentioned that in your chat, right? Why you need to be more directive perhaps is to remove some of that uncertainty that causes stress. Then your subordinates, or the people that are your directives, can function with greater comfort, with more psychological safety, with more comfort to explore and to be risk-taking. We're also seeing an onslaught of data. So at least for me and my colleagues every day, right, we see changes in different charts, numbers, and the question is, which ones are real, which ones are maybe fake news. So we're also perhaps seeing some reports that it's difficult to know if it's trustworthy or not. What is a death from COVID? Is it someone who only had COVID, or do they also have other diseases or comorbid symptoms? And how do we read the data? So there's uncertainty, there's fast rate of change in the current environment, there's stress, there is an onslaught of data, but also as leaders trying to figure out what is real data and what is maybe fake data. And so working with my clients, I'm seeing that the following skills or abilities are needed from their leaders during the current time. So the ability to act quickly, right? So to react to changes very quickly, the ability to adapt to these changes, a willingness to listen to and learn from others. And I saw some of you mention that in your in the chat window. So to listen to not only your direct reports, but people from other industries. What are they facing from experts, medical experts, people who are experts in epidemiology, etc. The ability to use data to make decisions. So how do you update decision-making based on new data? An awareness of what is happening both inside and outside your organization. That also is related to number 3, the willingness to listen. And lastly, this is an interesting one, not necessarily knowing where you're going to go tomorrow, but a vision for where you want to take your followers more long-term. So where do we want to be as an organization, as a team, when this is all done? Perhaps not knowing exactly how to get there, but providing some sort of a North Star, an inspiration for your team that helps reduce some of that uncertainty and bring people together. And what's interesting, as I said, is my colleagues and I have spent the last couple of years at IMD trying to answer the question of what skills, what abilities do leaders need during a time of digital disruption. And interestingly, I see some of the same competencies and skills we've seen in our other research projects being applicable to the current times. I'm going to quickly share that model of leadership in the digital age with you. To simplify, it looks like this 7-dimension competency model. So you see at the top right-hand part of your screen, I think it will be the top right for you, humble, or accepting that others know more than me. This is the willingness to be reflective of saying, what do I know, what do I not know, and what do I need to learn from others? Down here on the bottom right, we see adaptable. Changing my mind is a strength, not a weakness. When new data is presented to me that is relevant, that I see is applicable. Here on the bottom left, visionary. Having a clear vision of the future is more important than a detailed plan. Being engaged on the top left, always being in listening mode. I'm always listening to those around me, to my team. I'm trying to sense what is going on. And when we look in the center, then we have 3 competencies. First, informed decision-making, making use of data to make decisions, but also executing quickly. There in the bottom middle. And then hyper-awareness, constantly scanning of the internal and external environment for opportunities and threats. And when we developed this model, we never expected to apply it to the current crisis situation, but we have an assessment, a 360 assessment, that helps leaders to know where they are placed in this model in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And we're actually looking right now and seeing how much is this model built for digital disruption applicable to the current time. And I'm going to be curious which of these competencies or other competencies you're seeing as being necessary for your leaders, and we're going to get to that during the breakout. But at this point, I want to turn it over to our guest speaker here, Amelie. Gillian, is Amelie ready?
Yeah, I see Amelie is on the call. We're delighted to have Amelie Villeneuve, who is head of the UBS University at the Swiss Bank, and we thought it would be great to bring some of the concepts to life and to talk about what's going on in real life in Amelie's organisation. So, Amelie, are you ready to share some thoughts with us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this cool event. Thanks for the initial thoughts, and thanks for asking me to share at least some ideas of what we're doing. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. I'm calling from my kitchen table with my children next to me, so hopefully you'll forgive any upcoming background noise. But look, I think as we discussed when we were preparing for this, I think there is opportunity to be made in any point of turbulence. And in a way, I'm kind of lucky because my own personal career has really focused on running towards moments of turbulence, whether it's the Asian financial crisis or the global financial crisis, and working with companies to find opportunity. That doesn't mean profiteering. It actually means being open to renewal and just completely reimagining how we create value for our clients in these moments of turbulence. So for me, this is, not a great time, but also not the first time that I've gone through this, and I think for many of you on the call. What I've noticed in the best companies who have responded to COVID is that they, as quickly as possible, move towards finding opportunities for renewal, right? So in a way, I think one of the most dangerous phrases that we use is the new normal, right? Because it assumes that things will kind of go back to where they were before, and we had a sort of brief into moment of kind of working from home, and then we just go back. So what I was really happy about that across UBS we did, and especially in the university, is of course the first thing we did was to virtualize as much as possible, to postpone anything face to face, and to make sure that our employees and our partners were not at risk. But literally within days, we had started doubling down on our virtual curricula. We had put in place quite a lot of up-to-date material on how to work effectively from home. And then a topic that has always been close to us, but was even more important immediately, is how do you take care of yourself? How do you manage your mental health and well-being in periods of high stress? So I think the initial kind of crisis response was to give people information and informational learning on how to do those things. So we had this website which we provided curated information to on a weekly basis, and it's had a really good take-up rate. But what I'm most happy about, as I said, is that very quickly we then moved to thinking about what we should prioritize as ongoing capabilities. The things that really came clear to us, I think were clear to many other organizations, is that this is the perfect time to focus on entrepreneurialism. This is the perfect time to focus on growth and agility. And it fit actually as if by magic perfectly with the bigger 2020 initiative we have had to amplify our agile and transformational curriculum. So with that, we've launched this kind of foundational primer. We have launched an immersive one-day workshop. We are preparing a sim, and we're also preparing a bigger collaborative platform, which will eventually take the place of the website that we're currently housing things on. which will be launched in the next, I hope, 6 to 8 weeks, where we can start to work on these new ways of working together, sort of beyond information. So just to summarize, I think what we did quite well is that we very quickly moved to opportunity. We encouraged people to learn. We provided people with a lot of information, and I think we're quite good at realizing that just providing people with micro nuggets of content on remote working had a shelf life of about 2 to 3 weeks. Therefore, focusing on agile and more simulation, more contextual learning was really important to us. And luckily, we had some things in the pipeline that we've been focusing on. I think going forward, rebalancing our learning efforts towards collaborative sales, collaborative growth, collaborative transformation is still in line with the growth strategy that we had from the very beginning, and I think will serve us very well. In a way, it's an advantage because suddenly we don't have the luxury of having to cater to some people who might not be working from their offices, because everybody's working online. So it sort of forced the right behaviors. One more thing, and then I'll pause for breath, and you can please tell me if I've missed anything that you feel we discussed as particularly important. It's really interesting because actually we still haven't paused on a lot of our mobility, our job postings, the critical things that we are doing. We've been able, fortunately, to take a longer term perspective on it and keep going. And I'm really proud of that. But interestingly enough, the group of capabilities that we identified actually at the end of last year as areas that we want to focus on beyond past experience and kind of core financial services competencies are now more important than ever. So we refreshed our House on Leadership last year, and there were 4 areas that are really critical to us when we think about hiring beyond skills. These are around showing curiosity and inspiring others, being both inclusive and reflective, being able to innovate and transform, and being able to show drive and accountability. And you can probably hear that there's a slight deliberate tension in between those things, because for us, I think for many of you as well, learning is contextual, right? So it's not so binary that I must always be curious. I have to get things done as well. It's not so binary that I must innovate and transform, because without being inclusive and reflective, actually you just become schizophrenic. So there is a necessary tension between some of these kind of clusters of capabilities that we feel is really important. We pulled them out last year, and to us at least, these are still things that are important. In fact, they're even more important. So as we look to develop our leaders, as we look to hiring, as we look to continuing to develop our employee experience, we're still focusing on those things quite heavily. Hope that wasn't too long a monologue. Did I miss anything that you would like me to raise?
I guess if we have any specific questions for Amelie, you can pop them in the chat or do raise your hand. So I guess one question that has come through is, once the crisis is over, you talk about contextual learning. Do you expect to continue contextual learning, or are you likely to revert to something that was maybe your focus before?
No, so I mean, I've been at UBS for nearly 3 years now, and we have made a huge move, as I think is many companies, away from trying to teach you how to do today's job based on yesterday's data towards preparing you for different contexts. So, okay, I mean, today's context is probably more turbulent than, is sustainable over the long term. But this idea of leaders learning together for different contexts mean that, it doesn't matter if I can demonstrate curiosity in the isolation of a classroom when I'm being tested by a facilitator. What it actually means is that I should know where to be curious and where to get stuff done, right? And that's contextual. That's not ever going to be something that I can just learn the theory on and, get it done. I have this phrase which I don't know how many people like it, but I use it a lot. You know, I really believe that you can't get fit by reading a book about the Stairmaster, right? You actually have to get on the Stairmaster and practice. So learning helps us to practice for dealing with different contexts. And so these different contexts really are around, I think if you look at the broader global economy, it's just new opportunity, new levels of transformation, new innovation. It just comes from different places, right? So it's just not where we've been looking for growth and opportunity historically. But what this means, and I saw one of the comments coming through, what this means is that when you have contextual learning, leaders learn together, which means that instead of, you know, I'm in front of the classroom telling everyone what the right answer is, there is this ongoing coaching and mentoring process, which I think is so important for big complex companies, because it puts the discussion about decision making and leadership in the hands of the people who are actually doing it, not some kind of abstract person who's not actually even working at the company. Long answer, but yes, contextual learning I think is here to stay. Because I think it helps us to understand which clusters of capabilities we should try to prioritize and how we should sequence them.
Amelie, that's really beautiful. Although I have to say I'm disappointed about the Stairmaster one, because I've read quite a bit of websites these last few weeks about how to stay fit at home, and I thought that was going to do it for me, but I guess not.
I wish.
So we've gotten some questions on the side about just mentioning the 4 competencies again. If you could just run through them for
Sure.
people, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So they were showing curiosity and being able to inspire others, being inclusive and reflective, innovating and transforming, and showing drive and accountability. And as I said, they are deliberately not in tension with each other as in their sort of contradictions, but they're deliberately ones that are more on a Goldilocks scale than they are on an absolute scale, because it's all of those are important. You just have to figure out what the filters are depending on the problem set you're trying to solve for. One of the things I really loved about the papers that I read from you guys last year is the use of the Kennison Framework on decision making. We've actually used it quite a lot internally. And I think you can find the roots of a lot of these capabilities in that framework if you map them to different problem sets that we're trying to solve.
Just one point on the Kennison Framework. I'll type in the details of that if anyone wants to look it up. We also will be linking to the research that Amelie refers to that CRF wrote last year, which has the Kennison Framework and a whole load of materials there about leadership in complexity. So you know, that'll be available later for you to link to. Okay, Jennifer, I mean, there's lots of questions coming through, and perhaps what we can do is reflect during the breakout for some of these. But I think we're now on time to go into breakout groups. Now, what I'm just doing, Jennifer, do you want to lead us through that?
I can pull up the
questions
questions if you want. Sure.
As well.
And I think that's a great point, Gillian. What we'll do when you're in breakouts is just capture some of these questions and then bring them back. And Amelie, if you don't mind, maybe sticking around for the question and answer and being on a call for that part as well, that would be great. I'm going to share my slides again. So here we go. Thank you, Amelie. So breakout time. So you're going to have about 12 minutes once we get into your breakout room. And what I would like is for your team to choose one of the 2 questions to discuss. Perhaps you're going to want to take a quick photo of these 2 questions, as I don't believe your slides are accessible once you jump on to the breakout.
I've popped them in the chat actually, so that they're there.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so what competencies or skills do you see as being necessary for leaders in the current situation? So I mentioned 4, 7, Amelie mentioned 4. Are these the ones that you see, or do you also see some others? And then what are you doing within your organization to help leaders develop these competencies and skills through reflection and learning from their experiences? So what Amelie talks about as the contextual learning, what are you doing in that space as well? So you'll have 12 minutes, choose one of these questions, and when you come back, I mean, of course you can discuss the 2 of them, but when you come back, we're going to ask you to choose one of them. And in the chat window, type first A or B, so which one did you choose? And then one sentence to answer your question. And if you want to put commas or semicolons in there and make it a little longer, we will allow that. But try to keep it concise, because we're going to try to capture those learnings and then share them as a group. We'll also go into Q&A at that point. So I'm going to stop here. I believe Athena will put you into your breakout, and then we will come back in about 12 minutes. Good luck.
The most important thing we talked about was contextual learning, that different populations, even within the same organization, are in very different places and need different approaches to development. And too much leadership development in the past has been content driven rather than context driven.
That's super interesting. So maybe that's one thing I would like to get into in the discussion is, if you have these different populations with different needs, which I think every organization would identify with that, how do you adapt that learning? And maybe Amelie has some idea of how do you adapt that learning for the multitudes of different populations and making sure that it's appropriate for them. So great point, thank you.
Hello, it's Tom from TNG. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, Tom. Hi, we can hear you. Thanks.
Hi, Gillian. Thanks so much. So we were talking about something similar actually, and Oliver in our group in his organisation suggested, rather than sheep dipping people through content to develop specific competencies, it was about meeting people where they're at. So he created his organisation, and sorry to speak for him, by the way, his organisation did three, sort of a Zoom forum where there were three different opportunities to discuss either a specific competency topic, so talking about how to be a compassionate leader, where you get some learning content and then give people the space to be able to explore it. The second thing was then getting groups of peers together to discuss whatever was important to them. And then the third issue was, third opportunity was really getting people to focus on something a lot more strategic. And I think this is something that we're struggling with in our organisation at the moment, is that people are very much focused on the tactical, the here and now, the survival. So giving people the space to be able to think more strategically, more longer term, what's going to happen after we get out of this immediate period of survival. So I really like that suggestion, actually. It's something that I'd like to take back into our organisation.
Actually, just to that, Tom, I was on this is Zoe Higgins here, I was on a webinar yesterday, and they actually had a tool, and it might be something that Oliver in your group had and was using, but they actually used a tool to help you think strategically about what themes could be in the near future, and then actually again thinking quite blue sky, what could that reality look like, and what would you need to do to be successful to re-engineer what you're doing and the ways that you work against those realities that you're discussing. And it was actually a really interesting conversation in terms of not only the topics that you talk about and how they might connect, but what those realities might look like and what you need to do to be successful to do that. I'm happy to share that with Athena or Jennifer, that could be shared across more broadly.
Definitely interested. Thank you.
I think somebody just typed in the chat, what is that tool called? And I think this is I love that point that you just made, Tom, and I think you said it was from Oliver, is how do you get people in a time when you are in crisis? So the speed is important, right? Things are rapidly changing. How do you get people to step back and reflect and get out of that crisis mindset, which is more the strategic mindset rather than the tactical? So Zoe, if you could share that tool, if you know the name, that would be super, sharing in the chat. And I'm going to try to capture, by the way, all of the notes in the end in the chat and add them to the slides that we share with you afterward. And anyone else, any other ideas? If you had to, I see here, Verity, I believe that's your name, in the chat also said, we also talked about needing to turn to supporting leaders, to turning to thinking to the future of work. So I would love to hear from some others. I think this is a great point. And also maybe Amelie, if you want to join in, how do you get people into that strategic future, that vision that we talked about, that visionary mindset, and out of the crisis, more tactical mindset?
I think it's really interesting. This, for me, comes back to one of your first points about being directive versus being enabling or adaptable. I mean, I don't think they're actually in conflict with each other, by the way. I think you have to do both. but for me, it's been hardest to get people to see the medium and long term, because actually I think as executives we're quite well trained to deal with a crisis, especially when you've come through the last several crises. I mean, a friend from another bank, which I won't name, said, oh, well, we all love a good crisis. And it's a little bit true. I mean, as horrific as everything is right now, we're pretty good at like jumping into this kind of white knight crisis mode. And it is sometimes necessary to be directive in order to get people to focus on what's happening afterwards. Because otherwise, you know, there's the tyranny of panic, and I could be on calls for 24 hours a day easily, and just deal with today's kind of issues.
And also some ideas on how, because we talked about uncertainty being the case, right? If we say, how do you think long term? How do you think strategically for the future? When we don't know, I mean, one of my biggest clients is in the oil and gas industry, and I saw the announcement last night that we're now at negative oil prices. In a situation like that, how do you get people to think, what does the future look like? What does tomorrow look like? Any ideas for, in times of rapid change, what is the future? How do you get people to, first of all, think about that? Do you have multiple scenarios that they need to come up with, or continue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of scenario thinking. I think it's what the energy industry has been using very successfully for a long time. You know, Shell has done it for 50 years now. And there's a lot of great stuff written about it. I think if you try to handcuff yourself to one future, inevitably you'll fail, right? So preparing yourself for multiple speeds of multiple futures seems to be the only viable option, spoken from someone who has focused academically on strategy, I guess. So I think, yeah, I mean, we should not kid ourselves that there's one future that we're all looking for. There are multiple futures, and we are all in big companies that operate at multiple speeds anyway. So inevitably, it's about being able to deal with the complexity of different business models, different speeds, different possible futures. I think being able to get people to explore those futures together, as opposed to waiting to be instructed on what the future looks like from a separate unit or a separate part of the business, is an important first step. But for me, it comes down to playing together in different contexts, which allows you to discuss these futures.
Amelie, just one question that came up in the chat was, practically speaking, how you get people together to collaborate on possible futures. So, you know, how you actually make that work in practice, and particularly when people physically can't create at the moment.
Well, there's a bunch of stuff that you can actually use as a blueprint and adapt from outside. I mean, we created our own growth sprint methodology, which is only done virtually. We had the chance, luckily, to pilot it actually last year. And we've been kind of ramping up quite significantly. So when you take a growth sprint methodology, which is heavily informed by exponential thinking, Singularity University, I mean, the places that you would expect, then you directly put a mandate on leaders at, let's say, managing director or executive director level to think about the future whilst they rapidly prototype and accelerate something that they're working on right now. We've also done a significant investment in agile thinking. It's a sort of UBS way of looking at agile, which again forces you to think about the future and scenarios by forcing you to reconnect with your users, right? Start with the user, with user stories in mind, and suddenly there are multiple things that they would want. None of those things requires face-to-face classroom. That all requires big ears, active conversation with the outside world and with each other, but an opportunity to design to a minimum viable product that is then shared and coached in this kind of more brain training style approach to learning, rather than a lovely, fancy kind of, 3 to 5 day program.
One thing that we've done with a client in a past crisis, not the current one that we're in, and it was quite effective, is, I think we've all done the war games with your clients or your groups. And so this would be this idea of you pick different competitors and you put people in groups and say, how are we going to go to quote unquote war against these different competitors? How are we going to beat them in the market? We did the same for different scenarios. So you could do something like that with your team, and it works actually quite well to do it virtually as well. So you assign people to different future scenarios, and then they have to come up with different ways to go to battle against these different scenarios. So that's another kind of, it's a high energy and it works well in a virtual format.
Okay. So Jennifer, do you have any, how would you like to sort of summarize your thinking of what we've been observing this morning?
So I think, I mean, I've been trying to read the chats as you put the answers in, and as I said, I'm going to do this more thoroughly later and then share it back in the slides. But I think, Oliver, you made a very good point early on, and I see it being reflected more and more. Amelie, you also mentioned this, is that adaptable versus directive perhaps aren't two ends of the continuum, but can coexist. And we need leaders right now. I mean, this goes back to scenario thinking, right, that are able to contextualize their behavior. And so it goes back to the adaptability of sometimes you need to be more directive, sometimes you need to be less.
So we mentioned some questions when you were in the chat. I think maybe we can select two of them. The first one was acknowledging emotions. So it was around 11 o'clock in the chat room. Someone mentioned a question here that was from Daniel. So it says, what about the ability to openly acknowledge the more difficult emotions that the leader themselves or the teams may be going through? Probably more of an EQ competence. And I'm not sure when I broke out or the sound came out, but I was saying Amelie, and I think Oliver also made the good point that adaptability and directive is maybe not an either or, but how can you be both and switch between the two, which goes into this emotional quotient competence as well. Maybe hearing from, if Katharina, you want to join in, or Amelie, or anyone in the group about how do we deal with the emotions that are going on within these teams that is perhaps leading to dysfunction or even helping the teams to come together. So if there are difficult emotions on either end of the spectrum, how are you capturing that in this contextual learning that you have?
So this is exactly what I would love to speak about in the next 45 minutes or so. How can we be aware of emotions individually? How can we be aware of emotions and managing those in our teams that we are responsible for, or in the organizations that we're working with? So we're looking at a little tool in the next 45 minutes or so to, and I give you a couple of tips and ideas on how other leaders did it. So yes, we're happy to look at this question a bit more in detail next time, the next session. And I
Thank
think I
you,
also read
Katharina.
in the chat about the dysfunctional teams. That's also something we talk about when we talk about resilience, that this is a typical phenomenon that we see in crises, that crises surfaces dysfunctions in systems. So how do we be aware of them, and how do we mend these dysfunctions that become obvious now? Also part of the next session. Thank you.
One thing that we've done, and I'm not going to hopefully take away from the session with Katharina, but one thing we've done here at IMD, because there are some teams we're working with, and I have one client in particular where there is dysfunction within the team, and it is keeping them from being able to work together during this time, is we've assigned them a coach. So they're doing virtual team coaching at this point, and the coach actually works with each individual for 30 minutes per week, and then comes together and does a 90-minute group coaching session every week as well. And that has been, at least for the last few weeks, it looks like it's being very helpful for these teams to work out some of the issues they had when they were working face-to-face, and then be supportive for one another as well during the time of social distancing. So that's just one idea that we put into action with one of our clients.
Jennifer, there's one word that's been going through my mind a lot as we've been discussing this, that has come out of our research into leadership in an age of disruption, and it's the word paradox. So, you know, we talk about leaders having to balance the immediate emergency response to the situation and balance that against the long term. And I think, you know, when you think about industry disruption, there are all sorts of paradoxes that leaders have to deal with in a situation of complexity. You know, we sort of touched on the Kennison Framework, which is maybe one way of thinking about how to deal with paradoxes. But it strikes me that more and more, you know, leaders have a delicate balancing act of, you know, short-term, long-term, business as usual versus growth and disruption. You know, any number of paradoxes that we could talk about. But from your perspective, you know, what can we do to help leaders develop the capacity to deal with paradoxes and to keep these things, you know, to accept that we have to deal with them together. It's never going to be an either-or situation.
Yeah, so what we would call like almost leader ambidexterity, or how do you move between the two sides of the tensions? And I think Gillian will post one of the articles we've written about this, of how leaders work through tensions. But I guess in closing, looking at the time, I would say in answer to that, it's a requirement of two things. One is, and we talked about this already, right, sensitivity to the environment, which one is needed, and self-awareness. Where do I know which side of the tension do I tend to play with more? So we know that some leaders tend to be more directive, some tend to be more kind of adaptable, listening, humble. So knowing what your default is, and knowing when you're perhaps playing too far on your default and not moving towards the other side based on the situation. So anything that you can do, and just briefly, some of the things that we've done here at IMD, we've done with clients to make them more contextually sensitive, is things like emotional reading. So doing sessions on reading nonverbals, and how do you also do that in a virtual setting? I've done some sessions on that. How do you read nonverbals when all you're seeing is the shoulders up? Also, what I would recommend using are what are known as EAP, so experience, or ESAs, I'm sorry, experience sampling apps. What you can do is, if you're leading a virtual team, there's many of them available in app stores. They're called, again, experience sampling apps. You put one on your phone as a leader, but then you put one on the phones of your teams, and it's either can be randomly done, or at certain times the app will actually pop up on someone's screen, just like you need to rate, for example, your driver after an Uber drive, and it will say, you know, how stressed are you feeling at the moment? How much do you feel like you need more contact from your team? You can rate it on a 1 to 5 scale. And as a leader, when you're working, especially with a larger team that's dispersed, that's virtual, you can get either daily or weekly different reports from your team. So your team right now is feeling disconnected, or your team right now is feeling less stressed than it did yesterday. And so it can help you as a leader to sort of get a virtual gauge of your team. It also helps you to know if there's an outlier. So if everyone is feeling you know, good connection and feeling camaraderie, but there's one member of the team who's an outlier, it will give you that dot. So I would recommend maybe leaders also starting to use that as a way of getting a data baseline of where my team is, and then being a little bit self-aware of knowing where is my default, of where do I play, and how maybe giving tips, behavioral tips. We know it starts with behavior before mindset, of how I start to move to the other side of that tension. So, and Zoe asked, can you customize it for the experience sampling apps that are paid, that are a bit more expensive? Yes, you can customize the questions. You can customize the schedule. When are they delivered to the members of the team? And you can customize the questions. You can make them either open-ended, or you can make them rated. Yeah. So with that, I believe that we need to close. I will turn it over to Jillian. As I said, I'm going to try to capture the discussion as best as possible and add it to the slides that you're given afterwards. So thank you so much.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you very much, and a virtual round of applause for Jennifer. Thank you for that. Jennifer will be here for the rest of the session, so if there are other questions, then please keep them coming through the chat as well. The second part of this session, we're going to be talking about resilience. So hopefully that's primed you, ready, set up to think about how we develop resilience for ourselves and for our leaders. So I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Katharina Lange, who's going to share with us her thinking around leadership resilience. Thanks, Katharina.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you very much for the fantastic session and the Q&A that I've heard so far. My name is Katharina Lange. I am a professor of leadership here at IMD, and I joined IMD last year coming from Singapore, where I headed the Office of Executive Education at Singapore Management University. I am looking at resilience for a little while now. It was more of a collateral of looking into how companies become more agile, because necessarily when you're agile and execute very fast, likelihood that you meet unexpected results is pretty high. So how do you deal with them? That was the initial part of my resilience interest. Now in crisis, it appears that resilience is really something of high importance. And I'm looking forward to talking to you, speaking with you about resilience and how you can build more resilience yourself, and how you can build more resilience in the people who are working with you, who are living with you, who are around you. So this is a bit the agenda, the game plan for the next 45 minutes or so. Why do we speak about resilience now? How can you become more resilient yourselves? And how can you build resilience in the teams and the people around you? And as already said in the quick Q&A just now, I have a little framework about feelings, how we can get into a more thinking mode, and then what can we actually do meaningfully. And those are the 3 steps to build a resilient mindset. And I look very much forward to your questions and answers in the chat. I love seeing you on camera. It's fantastic. It's, for me as a speaker, it's really energizing. I can see you. It's almost like you were really here. Of course, I would wish that we could really meet here in Lausanne and shake hands and drink a coffee together. Hopefully this will be very soon. Use the chat functions, please, to comment, edit, ask. I tend to become really fast when I'm speaking. If that happens, please give me a warning sign. We will also use the Mentimeter a little bit later in the session. I'll have a different code. It's like Christmas Day 2004, so 25th, 1204. We don't need it now. It's about 5 minutes, but maybe you can already mentally prepare for going to the Mentimeter. Now, let me share a bit of maybe a personal story around this resilient mindset and about the crisis. For, let's say, half a year or so, I've been rereading Dante Alighieri's fantastic Divine Comedy. And I always enjoyed this very intellectual, complex read. It's a fabulous story about the medieval poet Dante Alighieri being taken by the hand by his paternal friend, fatherly friend, Virgil, a Roman poet. And the 2 of them embark on a very emotional journey through the 9 circles of hell. They eventually face Satan, they escape from the pit of Satan, and they then ascend through 7 terraces of purgatory to earthly paradise, where Virgil hands over Dante to his divine love, to Beatrice. So Beatrice picks up Dante and takes him through the 9 spheres of hell, where eventually they meet paradise, the Empyrean heaven. So this is a fantastic read. It's a complex story, has a lot of historic components to it. And while I was enjoying it intellectually, I felt the emotional disconnect. And then maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, when I woke up every morning to these headlines of people dying by the thousands, businesses collapsing, people getting unemployed by the millions, and no matter what trade-off we were looking at, there would be a trade-off. It was a lose-lose situation for me, my perception. And I felt, wow, this feels like hell. This is Inferno. And I was catapulted back to the 3rd canto of the Inferno of the Divine Comedy, where Dante and Virgil face the gates of hell. It says, abandon all hope, ye who shall enter here. So this is really how I felt. And I thought, wow, but the Divine Comedy really goes on, because at the beginning of the gates of hell, Virgil takes Dante's hand and he says, all cowardice must die. All you need is courage, and they go together. So this great fatherly friend, the leader, Virgil is a custodian, that's the Latin word for it. He looks after his Dante, and the 2 of them go and face the atrocities of Inferno. And as I just also said in the quick chat, I think this is what crisis does. It surfaces weaknesses. And as Dante and Virgil face the atrocities of humanity, you can read it also as the atrocities of weaknesses of Dante himself. So are we confronted in crisis with the weaknesses and the fault lines. The weaknesses and fault lines of healthcare systems, of economies, of business models, of societies, of teams, of dysfunctional teams, of families, and ultimately of ourselves. So the crisis is a huge mirror for us. And this is also how Dante sees the opportunity here, going through Inferno and then eventually making amends. He's paying a lot of effort in making amends to the weaknesses that he faced in Inferno, looking in the mirror, looking at the weaknesses that he has himself. And the amends, he really, you know, it's a huge effort climbing the terraces of purgatory, but the reward is so manifold. I mean, he meets his divine love, they eventually ascend to heaven. And I think this is for me the silver lining here, if I take the allegory. I think all of us are a little bit like Dante, and all of us are a little bit like Virgil. So I believe all of us have faced in the crisis huge, at least I have, huge amounts of anxiety, frustration, fear. Dante was paralyzed by the horror. And yet his friend Virgil took him by his hand and helped him along and reminded him of the purpose. The purpose was to meet Beatrice. And I think we all are Virgil as well. We all have people who we are responsible for. We have our children, our parents, maybe our neighbors, the teams that we are responsible for, the organizations that we are responsible for leading. So in the research work that I've done, I've spoken with leaders on many different levels, on country management level, on organizational global leadership level. And I would love to share with you some of the examples and some of the insights I've learned while we're going through this crisis. So maybe what I want to say with this, yes, it might feel hopeless. However, if we're facing the fear, if we're facing what the weaknesses, we can manage it, we can put effort into it and learn from it. And for this one, we need the integrity. And then, so what is it then? What is it that we would define as resilience? What is it that makes us going through hell and making these amends in purgatory to eventually arrive in heaven? There are many definitions for resilience. Some of them say, well, it's to remain calm and composed in crisis. Some say it's the ability to bounce back or bounce forward. I like this definition very much. It's a definition from Androzoli, and it says, resilience is the capability of a system, organization, or a person to maintain its core purpose and integrity in face of dramatically changed circumstances. I think we all would agree that the current circumstances have dramatically changed. If we look back at January and now, it's an entirely new world. How can we remain the purpose of ourselves, of our teams, of our organizations, and our integrity of head and heart? How can we remain that in the crisis a little bit more strongly? And maybe we can even deepen the integrity, because now we're facing our weaknesses and we have the opportunity to work on our leadership capabilities, leadership as in leading ourselves. So this is a little bit what I would like to speak about and where I would like to share the work that I've done in the couple of years prior. Let's start with the emotions. We just heard it. I mean, all of us have gone through emotions, I believe. And in adversity and crisis, we are going through a set of very strong emotions. And I'm just going through it briefly. Most of you will be familiar with the Kubler-Ross Cycle, or the work that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did earlier. So most of us are, when we're confronted with adversity, responding first with shock and denial. This can't be true. This can't be me. No, this is somebody else. This is another world, right? We avoid it. Second, we might respond with anger, frustration. This was the best year to come. I had so many plans for this year. We wanted to go on holidays. It can't be that this is not possible. It's anxiety, irritation. Will I lose my job? I don't know. There's so much uncertainty out here. We might feel overwhelmed and helpless, sad and even depressed. Some of us respond with hostility or even get in fight mode or flight mode. but after a while we struggle through it and we try to find meaning. That's when the rational side kicks in. This is when feeling shifts into thinking. This is when we start reaching out to others, seek guidance, and eventually we explore something new. We accept the situation as it is and move on. And the fact that many of you have dialed in here today means that we're all seeking guidance from one another and that we're all hopefully preparing to move on. And the most courageous of us who went through this exercise, who went through the crisis, they are thankful. We are thankful for the lessons we have learned because we've been confronted with weaknesses and we learned to make amends and then move on. So let's have a moment to reflect. Crisis is an emotionally very exceptional situation. Let's have a quick moment to reflect on what feelings came up for you individually. For you individually, mostly during the past crisis weeks. So it's now the question for you as an individual. What did you feel mostly? And if I can ask you to go to the Mentimeter, the code is 251204, and I will share the Mentimeter with you in a minute. So you should see now in a word cloud, frustration predominantly, overwhelmed, yes, but also opportunity, frustration still center, frustration, anxiety, anxious, disbelief. We're 40 people now, 43. I see some opportunities coming up already, which is fantastic. Curiosity, but also disbelief, anxious, frustration still very much in the center. Uncertainty, exhaustion, yes, it must be very, very exhausting in the moment. Sadness about the things that we can't do, that we have lost. Some of you might have lost relatives or friends. This is deeply saddening, of course. Anxiety, but you see the anxiety, or there was just a moment where opportunity was as big as anxiety. I think we're at a tilting point in the moment. So we have 100 now. Let's stop it here. So for the moment, we still have a lot of frustration and anxiety, but we also see opportunity and then the emotion or the opportunity that we see to move on. This is very much in sync with what we know from research. So I share my slides back. So it's fantastic that you were all able to be aware of the emotions you went through. Now I ask you for the emotions that you felt yourself. If I ask you the next question, how might other people around us feel? And does it change the way that you feel? So for example, if I think, how might the little restaurant or shop owner next to my house feel now, who's threatened of losing his business? How might a good friend of mine feel who has lost his mother in the crisis? Who might somebody feel, let's say in the United States, who got just unemployed or laid off? How might those people feel? And if I think about families in which children are not safe, how might those children feel? The moment I am deflecting from myself, I already feel a bit better because I realize that simply being able to stand here, talking to you now, means that I'm already on the luckier side of the equation. And I think this helps me to also come to terms when I tend to feel into self-pity, and if the anxiety becomes too much, I say, well, Katharina, focus on what you have and look at people who are by far worse off. And you see that this little trick is something that also helps to deal with emotions and also to think about what is it that I could take out of it. And as you might have realized, Latin was my first foreign language. So I studied a lot of Seneca when I was younger. And I loved this quote that I came across the other day. No tree becomes rooted and sturdy unless many a wind assails it. For by its very tossing it tightens its grips and plant its roots more securely. The fragile trees are those that have grown in a sunny valley. So this is what we know from anti-fragile research, that we need a bit of a storm to really become very sure and very strongly rooted, and at the same time anti-fragile. So how can we do it? And I'd love to share a couple of examples, and all these heads here, they stand for people or represent people who I have spoken with. And what I would love to share with you here is how can we keep our integrity? How can we even deepen our integrity? How can we use the crisis as an opportunity to deepen our integrity on 3 different dimensions? On the one side, being able to be aware and have access to emotions. Secondly, rationalize, get into thinking mode and make sense of the crisis. And thirdly, come up with meaningful actions and getting into doing mode. And I would love to share some examples for you for you as an individual, because we know if we're not healthy individually, we can't and we should not lead a team. So there's a bit of ideas on what we can do individually. Second, examples from leaders of teams, let's say country managers with a leadership span of maybe 5 to 25 people. And then leaders of organizations who are really in charge for thousands of people, what they shared with me, what they do to really get aware of the emotions in the organization, get into sense-making mode, and what they actually did. Let's start with the feelings, because this is feelings, emotions are an algorithm. They are an algorithm to warn us. So feelings are something we should need to take really, really serious and be aware of them to see whether there's something going on that we need to be aware of. 2 things I would like to emphasize here. The leading yourself. I love the journaling idea. Most of us maybe have done it. What I love to suggest here is, in times of crisis, create an office hour for your thoughts. What I mean with that is, we're all sometimes overwhelmed, and I saw in the word cloud, there's overwhelmed, right? There's this feeling helpless and overwhelmed. Whenever these thoughts come of anxiety, of frustration, or sadness, you create an office hour for your thoughts. You say, tonight from 8 p.m. to 8:30 p.m., I will have time for you, dear thoughts, not now. So go away, anxiety, I'll deal with you later. At 8 p.m., you sit there with a pen and a piece of paper, maybe a cup of tea. You sit there and then you say, okay, thoughts, now you can come, and all the emotions are allowed to come. And you sit there and you write them down. And the moment you're writing them down, you already distance yourself from it, because they're now on the paper and you can look at them. And the good thing is they're getting out of your head. You have a chance to read through it. And maybe you find 2 or 3 nuggets of gold that you can cut out of this cathartic process. And maybe sometimes you need to do it daily. If it's really too much, you will see normally that after a while, it's okay to do it twice every second day, maybe once a week. I'm now at the stage where I can do it once a week. I have my fixed appointment on Sunday afternoons. I meet my thoughts, and then I write them down, whatever there is, and look at them and what is there. So the office hour for thoughts is a very helpful tool I found. Second, I found it super helpful to meditate. I've been on the Vipassana meditation training myself. And I do that also regularly, at least once a week with a group of friends. We include metta meditation, which means first we think about being happy for ourselves, being at peace, and then we extend the circle that we look at, and essentially we are wishing well to the entire world if possible. Meditation also helps us to focus and to center where we are in the present moment. This is the only moment we are really actually alive. So those would be 2 pretty helpful tools. I've spoken to a CEO who runs a UK-based company, and he says, I'm journaling every day because when this crisis is over, I want to make sure that I've done a good thing, that I've done what feels right. And another good friend of mine, she's a coach. She starts a coaching a session every time in the company. It was a similar situation that Jennifer mentioned. It was a dysfunctional team. They're starting with a short meditation of 5 to 7 minutes to just really set the frame and put everyone in the same positive mindset. This helps to work with dysfunctional teams too. if you're the team leader, and this is one that I've heard from 2 different teams, they set up a buddy system. So there's one person who speaks, you know, they look after each other, like Dante and Virgil, and they change roles. General, the recommendation is when you have emotions really being very vivid in the moment and they're negative, try to make them non-contagious. Well, they are contagious. Negative emotions are as contagious as positive ones, so you want to confine them. So allow for small groups and keep the time limited. So maybe not more than 30 minutes, and then encourage to break up and do something else and to move to positivity. On an organization level, we hear that you need to increase the communication. Well, that's a no-brainer. You want to listen very well because the emotions are a warning sign, a warning lamps, and you want to be aware of them. And all organizational leaders I spoke with, they had a very intricate communication schedule, not so much as a broadcasting schedule, that's necessary too, but more of a listening schedule and finding out where the emotional warning lights might go on. Maybe I'll pause here for a minute to see whether there are questions in the chat. Oh yeah, I see. On the point, communicating more than we think is necessary, yeah. Can I ask Julie, maybe you can scan the chat for me, and we will summarize after I've been through all the 3 pillars of this framework, and then we have a summary. Okay, super, thank you. The second dimension. So after we're aware of emotions, and if again think back, if you did the journaling and you saw what is there, so I'm really anxious, I feel overwhelmed, then you create the distance, then you go into thinking mode. One thing that also Seneca mentioned, the growth mindset. What can I learn out of it? How can I get more sturdy? How can I make amends to the weaknesses I faced? What can I learn out of it? What is it that I can take particularly as a learning point from me? How will I grow stronger in this crisis? Another tool that I found very helpful is the thinking about the circle of concern. So everything on my health is concerning me, but what is actually the circle of influence that I have? In COVID, in the moment, there is no vaccination available. The only thing I can actually do is wash my hands, keep social distancing. The means are very limited at the moment, but I do them religiously. And then I hope that the concern that I have is manageable. It is not, but it feels like it. Yeah. So focusing on what you can really actually do. And the third one, and that was my earlier point, reflecting from egocentricity, being aware that you're part of a larger social fabric, that we can actually influence more people around us positively than we might think, but also deflecting from self-pity helps to get into thinking mode. And the last point definitely is the values and the purpose. This is where the initial story of Dante comes in handy. Beatrice, this divine love was the purpose for Dante. So what is your individual purpose? What is the values that are driving you? And maybe this is a good time to reflect on them again and maybe add solidarity and compassion to them. We can really we can make a difference if we're becoming more compassionate, more collaborative, more solidaric in these times. The crisis invites us to do that. So again, the coaches that I work with, they have a lot of coaching sessions now on really recentering focus, recentering values, and recentering purpose. And they do that with individuals, and they do that with leaders of teams. And you see, and we had it in the initial or in the earlier discussion, if you're going into the strategic thinking process, if you're moving from the tactic steps to a more midterm to long-term strategy, you also will recenter the discussion on the values that drive the team, and then also on organizational level, the values that are driven or that are held high in the organization. So the centering on values is a very, very helpful discussion because it helps you to make sense of it. It helps you to be very clear on what the purpose is of your organization. On the organizational level, I would like to emphasize the empowerment. One of the leaders I spoke with, he said, you have to empower teams. You have to be very agile on the ground. So you have to trust your teams, enable them to make very decentralized decision-making, And my two colleagues, Howard Yu and Mark Raven, for example, they've published just another wonderful examples on how, in particular, Chinese companies did that. They reflected, or they reflected the decentralized decision making in the organizational structure, so that people are really not only empowered but also functionally enabled to make decisions on a cross-functional level. And then supporting departments under strain. This is something where you as responsive leader support anyways. Okay. Now last, and the doing part, we heard this morning that in times of uncertainty, we love safety, we love certainty, right? So whatever we can do to create the perception of safety, we should do. It starts with creating a structure for yourself. I think this is what we all learned in the last 4 weeks working from home. We created a routine, a structure, your yoga session in the morning, your run in the afternoon, the ritual of sharing foods with the people you work and live with, really cultivating your social network. These touchment points, they build the frame in which we feel safer. Also focusing on small tactical wins and have a positivity list. Our brain is naturally, through evolution, wired for negativity, we know, right? So bad is always stronger than good, at least in our perception. If we have a negativity list, if you have a positivity list, my excuses, a friend of mine does that very regularly, and she shared it in our meditation circle. Every evening she would write down 10 good things per day, religiously, to remind herself that life can be good and that she's focusing on this. This is a nice juxtapose to being overwhelmed and feeling anxious. It's just training your brain to see positive things. On a team level, you can do that as well as a tool, but you also want to provide structure and clarity. One of the first interviews I did in crisis was scheduled a long time before, but when I interviewed this managing director of a country organization in Singapore and Malaysia, it was just the day when the prime minister in Malaysia had stepped down, and she said, you know what, to this entire COVID situation, which is going like a wrecking ball through Asia and through our business, we now have this political instability. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, the first is I look after my people, so make sure that they are safe. And I provide a structure for them. I check with them every day, and it was just at the beginning of the COVID crisis. I check in with them every day, in the morning at 9 and at lunchtime, in the afternoon, to see whether they are fine, and also to see whether we are really achieving the milestones that we set for ourselves. And we also have a debate as to how we would like to work. Do we continue in work on site or work from home mode? And how do they prefer to work? So she communicated very transparently. She created a safety environment, a schedule for their team, and she kept her eye on the quick wins, really on the achievement that she could do to broadcast or to send back positive messages to them. It was a very participative leadership style, and the same holds true on the organizational level. Regular open communication, provide structure and clarity, share what you can share as far as you can, and focus on the quick wins to achieve the next steps. The feedback that I heard from the organizational leaders. Now, before we go into the breakout, maybe I pause here for a minute and ask Gillian whether there are questions on these examples I have given, or whether you want to hear more examples.
Yeah, so one of the questions that's coming out of the chat is that there's again this idea of looking at communication, and there's, on the one hand, we need to make sure that we provide enough communication, but on the other hand, there's a risk of overload and also inauthenticity. So there's a kind of balance that we need to achieve here, and I guess that to summarize a number of the questions that are coming through on that is, you know, how do we get that right, particularly when we're working in complex organizations with in matrix structures, or, you know, involved in lots of different projects. How do we get that balance right?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. And yes, let me start with your authenticity part. you only can communicate authentically with authenticity when you're at terms with yourself. This is why I stress the leading yourself first part. So you need to be aware of your anxiety, and you must have found a way to manage it. If you're talking anxiously in front of everyone, people pick it up immediately. So this is the part where you need to be convinced that whatever you're saying is the right thing to do. And you've come to terms, you're leading yourself really well and with confidence. Then on the communication part, well, there are things, as we all know, that leaders can share and things that they can't share. One example was that leader, he went through all the worst case scenarios, really thinking through everything, really to the as much as he could, to the last dollar and cent. And then thought, okay, from there I derive that's a medium or moderate solution that I can present to the team so that they get a range of what is possible and what not. However, he communicated or emphasized the possibility, the upsides, the opportunities, and also focused on the tactical wins and the positive messages that he could share with them. There's always the risk that you're sharing things that you have to pedal back with. There might not be, might turn out not to be true. This happens in crisis. As soon as they admitted that they made a mistake, that they were transparent about it, people forgive you. Everybody knows that this is a quick moving environment and there might be information that are not right. But the moment they feel or they prove to be different after 1 day or two, but the moment you can admit it and say, sorry, this information was not correct, it should be like this, and this is what I know for the moment, I think people will forgive you. That's fine.
Okay, thanks, Katharina. I think now would be good to move to the breakout. Yeah, I'm just and again I'll put the questions in the chat, so they're there for people to refer to.
Okay, so again, we would like to send you in a breakout. We also would like to have this coming together as an opportunity to share with one another and to learn from you. And the question is here really, what has worked for you? We're about, depending on where you are and which geography, we're between 8 and 6 to 8 weeks in the crisis. In the past weeks, most of you have experienced very strong emotions in your immediate environment. What support are you providing to leaders in your organization to manage the situation? So you as the ones, as a Virgil here, you're supporting your leaders around you. What support could you provide to the leaders around you? And if you're in a group, please share your best practices. And maybe you can select a speaker or so in the group who then shares the findings of the group in our chat after we come back together. The conversations in the breakout rooms. Can we have volunteers to share their insights in the chat? And I would love to hear from Vicky Smith. Where are you? From Brewing Dolphins, to share your experiences. Would you do us a favor and share what you've been through in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. So what I've done is I've just prepared a bit of a newsreel of kind of things that we've done. There's a slide to share a little bit later on, but when I offered and was invited to do this, I thought, oh gosh, well, where do we start? And I thought, well, while it may seem quite obvious, crises are crises because they affect people, and Katharina, you talked to that earlier. But however, from what I've read about leaders who have been more in reactive mode, they're becoming sort of trapped by focusing on daily metrics, share prices, revenues, costs, etc. And it occurs to me that while these are obviously fundamentally important, and certainly from a UK's perspective, we've seen lots of support, furloughing at 80% monthly salary, capped at 2.5k. We've seen various measures for small businesses now coming through that will certainly help to reassure and boost recovery. It is important to remember that things like share price, revenue, costs are actually the outcome of coordinated efforts of us and our people. So when I thought about what I wanted to talk about here, we've got to remember organisations exist in order to accomplish together the things that none of us can do alone. So looking back at Brewin Dolphin and our response and how we're coping toward this, I think what's really supported us is over the last 4 or 5 years, we've worked hard on a number of fronts with many levers to develop an inclusive and open leadership culture. And that's really been at the core of the things that I'm going to talk about. So very quickly, following the announcement of lockdown and removal for the vast majority of us to remote working, we've seen two very clear responses at our organisation. First of all, we've seen, if you like, the reassuring stuff. Everybody moving to video calls, feeders on support for remote working. We've been very supportive of people that are juggling work around children when the schools shut, etc. People who are living in flats on their own, not able to get outside quite as often, enjoy any outdoor space other than once a day. And I think it's absolutely been a time where our own human resources team have been able to and have needed to step up. We've completely been on the front foot with practical guidance around absence, annual leave, well-being, etc. And certainly my own L&D team, we've been busy producing videos, virtual learning channels, all in an effort to support colleagues with balancing remote working and well-being, personal resilience, managing remotely, support helping to deal with tricky client questions, and maintaining our business as usual routines, because those are important too. So the learning programs that we would normally be delivering the way that we used to do it, we are continuing to keep that schedule in place, but have very, very quickly redesigned ways of doing things differently. A bit like we've done today with the conference. We're supposed to be in wonderful Lausanne at the moment, and instead we're all on a Zoom call, but the show goes on. The second area that we've been very attentive to is the fun stuff. So no doubt I won't be alone if I say we've had people around our organisation. We're quite small as a corporate. We're 2,000 headcount thereabouts, but we've got virtual coffee breaks going on. We've had live Zumba on a Thursday lunchtime. We've had company-wide Skype quizzes last thing on a Friday afternoon, fancy dress Fridays, weekly team and department challenges. So this is all the morale boosting kind of activities that I think are very, very important, because they do keep us more resilient and they do help us to be more productive. So in a way, we've never been better connected. One of the things that I'm leading on at the moment is a working group called Singing from the Balconies. So that's very much in a refrain to the uplifting impact of what we saw in Italy a few weeks ago in their desperate and darkest of times. But what we're trying to do is plan a sensitive approach to balance that reassuring communication with the fun stuff over the coming weeks, to share across our group all of the things that people are doing, as I say, with the senior leadership communication refrains as well. So coming on to the senior leadership space, I think one of the key things that I would call out is the importance of very timely communication. Our senior leaders have been, again, very much on the front foot with making sure that well-timed communications, almost anticipating questions and concerns before they're actually raised, which is, they're probably in the minds of people, but actually the raising of those concerns often lag behind them actually being there. People will talk to their peer groups, but sometimes they're a little bit frightened to maybe speak up to senior leaders about those. So we've been trying to anticipate those and organise our internal communications and messaging around all of that. So I would say that what we're doing is very authentic, it's honest, it's genuine, and the feedback we're getting from the business is one of colleagues genuinely feeling that they're in trusted, safe hands. And I think certainly we are practicing what we preach. We're a financial services sector. Those of us that are from that sector will know the issue around trust that was very much broken 10, 12 years ago from now. So we're working very hard on practicing what we preach on the trust area. So just some of the things that we've been doing. Intranet site, we've got a front page redesign, quick click in so people can get very clear access to all of the communications that are going out on a chronological basis. It's being updated daily, multiple channels, Skype, social media, helping to bring teams together, and very conscious, values-led, warm and empathic tone to all of our communications. It's all about supporting and reassuring colleagues. So if I can ask for the slide to be popped up, that's great, thank you. I wrestled with how to give some kind of a visual presentation to everything that's going on, and this was the best that I could come up with. So hopefully you'll be able to follow my train of thought. So on the left-hand side, for me, this is how our leadership context is being both presented and lived out. So there are interactions across the three key areas of colleagues, clients, and community. In terms of community, we've already given significant donations to the National Emergencies Fund. We've also released a pot of money to allow employees to access for local charitable causes. So we've been we're not making a big fuss of it, that might come later in annual reports, etc. But at the moment, we're just quietly doing what we believe is the right thing to do for community. In terms of some of the things that we've implemented across these areas, and I'm not going to go through each in turn because many of them do overlap, a bit like my Venn diagram suggests. Things we've done, we've taken a very warm and caring practical stance for those employees who are looking after school-aged children or other dependents. We've given employees enhanced flexibility to care for dependents, and we've allowed them to change their work patterns around those caring responsibilities. During the crisis, we've also decided that employees with caring responsibilities will continue to be paid 100% of their salary if they can work in excess of 50% of their contracted hours. So we've been very directive about the policy guidance around that, which again has been much appreciated. We've not made anybody redundant, we haven't furloughed anybody. We've made a commitment to continue to do all we can to ensure that this continues throughout the crisis and as a result of the crisis. We've honoured all offers of employment to people who were going to join us. We're still rolling out induction, but doing it virtually. For the few employees who are at the moment less occupied, we've looked at how can we redeploy, temporary re-employment, redeployment of those resources to other parts of the business and to other teams. And that's great because it encourages their learning and their development as well. It's that broadening out people's understanding. So we've seen that very much as an opportunity for us. In the sickness absence space, again, just some practical, I guess, process procedural stuff for everybody. We've doubled sick leave entitlement for those with under a year's service. We've got new processes in place to capture absence at an earlier stage. And we've also agreed that any absences during this time will be disregarded from any performance management or disciplinary issues regarding our absence. So again, just very, very clear messages to people: look, if you're poorly, stay off, you know. And I think that's super important. And in terms of holidays as well, because again, you know, we've got to be mindful that people will be cancelling their annual leave at the moment. So we've decided to increase holiday carry forward. We've doubled it into next year. We've given very clear guidance on around how employees should continue to take their holidays during this time. And we've set in place a very clear guidance that we want people to have taken 2 weeks annual leave in whatever form, shape or variety before the end of August. It's important to still take some time off. And then on the morale, well-being and connection side, we're continuing to make private medical GP service employee assistance programs available as normal. And financial hardship, we've also put in place a fund that offers people who are on less than 70,000 sorry, base salary, interest-free loans, emergency interest-free loans, and it just goes on. So there's some very powerful stuff.
Sorry, I'm a bit afraid of time. I see a lot of people dropping up. We're a little bit behind time already.
Okay.
And thank you so very much. Is there one point that you would like to emphasize closing?
Yeah, I think probably just moving to where you saw the two, the leadership and how things have morphed. The one key thing that I've seen is in the early stage of the crisis, leadership and operational leadership were very much entwined. We're now seeing a splitting out of those two. So the strategic leadership now is very clearly delegating to the operational leadership so they can focus on the future and operational people can get on with the here and the now.
This is the picture of Dante and Beatrice in Empyrean in the heaven. And maybe this is the outlook. So how will you be stronger after the crisis? This is the last thought I would like to leave you with. What is it that you will learn in the crisis that you have learned? If you can share this one in the chat with us, so we all get inspired by people who have learned something. I definitely can say for me, I learned a lot about digital teaching and about listening and moving around more digital. I've done some work with digital transformation, but I've never been digitally transformed as fast as in the last 4 weeks. So this for me is the biggest learning. if you could share some of the things for you, I would be so pleased to hear from you. And also any other comment and any other additional question that we can address. I know that we're running a bit out of time, but love to hear where you get better and where you get stronger. And I hand officially over now to Gillian to close the session. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd just like to say huge thank you to Jennifer, to Katharina, to Amelie, and to Vicky, and thank you to you all for taking time out of your very busy day to spend some time reflecting on leadership in the time of disruption. We'll be sharing a recording of the session and notes within the next day or two. Feel free to add any further comments or questions in the chat. We can address those separately. And wishing you every strength as we go forward. Thank you very much for sharing your day with us.